morning. Oh, what a beautiful morning. I'm just so thrilled to see so many of you here today, so many of you back from yesterday, and I hope you're feeling the way we're feeling, which is incredibly blessed for the convening and gathering yesterday, for the spirit, for the engagement of all of you, and really looking forward to today. I woke up this morning thinking about the words of Carrie Mae Weems. How do you measure a life? By the margin or by the way in which we confront this moment in history. And I think we're all feeling that. We're all feeling that. In fact, I do an exercise with myself in which I ask myself, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, looking back, what will I wish I had done? And I use that as the driving force for organizing how I show up in this moment. And then Theaster Gates, is he here this morning? I'm gonna catch up with him later. He said we need the agency of our own people to protect who we were. We have to ensure that the future remembers. And it got me thinking about the work I've been doing around the 14th Amendment Center and really being serious about us being founders and framers of the next iteration of democracy in this country. And in particular, I've spent so much time trying to understand what did we do in the past, because I am a lover of history, and particularly African American history. What did we do in the past in the worst of times? Isabel Wilkerson had told me that she thought we were entering a new nadir, and she told me that 10 years ago. And she was right. I became curious about what did we do in the first nadir. For those of you who don't know, the nadir is a term that was used by the historian Rayford Logan to describe what he called the worst period for Black people after slavery. So basically the 1880s, most people would say to 1920, I would kind of take it up to the Second World War, when most Black people were caught in economic exploitation through sharecropping or domestic work, in which half of this country existed under legal apartheid, the nadir, lynching rampant throughout the country. And what fascinated me about my study of the first nadir is that people didn't just wait around for the nadir to end. They started doing things. They started doing the things that I have been calling us all to do, which is to plant. And it turns out that this period, the nadir, is the period in which, particularly for African American communities, we created the infrastructures that became the framework that allowed us to push for full freedom 60, 70, 80, 90 years later. During this period was the creation of most of our fraternities and sororities, the Deltas and AKAs and Alpha Phi Alpha. This was the period in which Charles Hamilton Houston at Howard was incubating and developing this crew of amazing young attorneys who would go on to challenge Jim Crow. This is the period when HBCUs were exploding and Black churches were growing around the country. It amazes me that this was the period in which the first Black-owned banks were chartered, but moreover also the period in which we had the most powerful artistic movement of the 20th century in this country, the Harlem Renaissance. Think about how we still live from the fruit of the seeds planted by those people in the worst of times. That became the platform upon which we were able to live and make a way in this country. And our lamentation that we feel at this moment is our lamentation over the fact that we lived in this harvest from those people and that we can see the fading of that harvest. But that is a sure sign that it is time for us to plant in this period. Now understand that those who oppose freedom, justice, equality, love, humanity also plant. They also plan for a future. And they planned in that period too. And part of the purpose of doing the historical study is that we can see the cycles. And while we understand many of the things they planted in state constitutions, convict leasing, obviously Jim Crow, the framework of our unequal criminal justice system, all of those things we know. But we must also be conscious of the fact that a key part of the planting, maybe the most powerful part, was the planting of narrative. And they planted those narratives through some of the things we talked about yesterday, the whole monuments movement, the creation of Confederate monuments around the country, which really saw their peak in the 20th century, like 1911 to 1930 or 31, right? Most of the Confederate monuments that we see around the country were created during that period, not even like immediately after the Civil War. And they were created with deliberation by the Daughters of the Confederacy, who wanted to celebrate their fathers and their grandfathers and their uncles, and for some, their husbands. And they created a curriculum project, a textbook project, that ensured that American textbooks for children in K through 12 would tell a very particular story about the South during the Civil War. And many people used that same framing well into the 1960s and beyond. And so that story was incubated into the American population, not just in the South, but throughout the country. And then there was a scholarly angle to it. William Dunning, the professor at Columbia University in New York, who developed a whole scholarly vision of the lost cause and trained generations of young historians in this idea that the noble South had lost this battle to preserve culture. It's important for us to understand that because I'm a civil rights lawyer, and I think all civil rights lawyers would tell you in this moment that it's not enough, and that we have been more defeated by narrative than we have been defeated in the courts. We have been defeated by the story of who we are in this country. We have been defeated by the story of nobility that has been assigned to those who would oppress us. And so we need to understand that even people engaged in the business of oppression need heroes. And they will make heroes out of the most improbable people. Because one of our powers is our story. It's a story that hasn't been shaken. The story of the civil rights movement, for example, is such an incredibly noble story. No one thinks about John Lewis with scorn. You think about John Lewis and it makes you smile, it gives you peace. You think about Diane Nash, you think about the Selma to Montgomery marchers, you think about the Birmingham marchers, you think of noble figures like Medgar Evers who gave their life for freedom and equality, gave their lives for things they never saw. Charles Hamilton Houston died in 1950. He never saw Brown versus Board of Education, even though it was his brainchild. Those noble stories are incredibly powerful and incredibly threatening to those who do not believe in justice and equality. And so I want to encourage you to know that as we talk about this work together, vision and justice, that those of us in the civil rights space are powerfully aware of our limitations. We are powerfully aware. Now, I'm good. You know, I know what I'm doing. I know how to do what I'm doing, but I'm very much aware of my limitations. And I'm very much aware that it is the work that you do that sustains us. And so my hope is that we're going to build these connections even more powerfully than we have been trying to do. And my partner in crime, Sarah Elizabeth Lewis, who was way out ahead of me on this, is such an incredible guide to understanding this space. She and I are kind of a yin and yang, good cop, bad cop, artist and lawyer, but with a deep understanding and respect for the work that we each bring to the table. Someone said to me yesterday, after one of our sessions, that it was very moving to see two women who support each other and who are loving and kind to one another. And I want you to know that that is very intentional. I've been around for a minute. And I have a very clear vision of how I interact with women in the public space. I am one of 7 daughters I have 3 daughters. And showing up in the world as women who are comrades and friends, who extend grace and tenderness to one another, who are generous to one another, and who want only the best for one another, is its own form of resistance. And I am eternally grateful for the beautiful, powerful, lovely collaboration and friendship that has developed with my friend, Sarah Elizabeth Lewis.
Oh, good morning. I'm taking in this moment as I process having this partner in good trouble with Sherrilyn Ifill. You've heard me say yesterday all the many ways in which I want to salute her extraordinary spirit, tenacity, vision, grace, sisterhood, and fellowship. I have learned so much from working with her, to working with all the loving hands that put this convening together with us. I've learned also that she speaks many languages. She can deftly craft a Supreme Court amicus brief, and she can masterfully create the Spotify playlist that you've heard throughout the day. She can do so. It's all her. It is all her. Boundless energy, boundless grace. My goodness, what a model we have in this 21st century civil rights icon and leader. My colleague, my friend, Sherrilyn Ifill. Well, this is day 2 of the Vision and Justice Now convening. And for those of you who were here yesterday, you've heard us both speak about the remit of this convening, which is to ask this unasked question: what is the power of art and culture for justice? To extend the measure of gratitude I have for now, with Sherrilyn Ifill, being able to launch this with an extraordinary collaborator, I want to just salute one additional man who allowed me to see that this partnership might be possible. Near the end of John Lewis's life, I was honored to receive a call from his office, inviting me to speak about the power of culture for justice in what would be his penultimate pilgrimage from Selma to Montgomery. Check your office voicemail. That's where this message came in. I had no idea that the late John Lewis knew about Vision and Justice. We had met, we had been at the Aspen Ideas Book Festival years ago, and as we were signing books together, he saw my last name and said that we must be kin. In truth, we are all in lineage with John Lewis because of the contributions that he gave to this country. One of the many ways in which this is so just takes us back to the Selma to Montgomery March, the historic journey that began on Sunday, March 7th, 1965, when he was just 25 years old and chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. During the month of what culminated in the roughly 50-mile protest, the path of America truly changed. He helped lead, as many of you know, 600 peaceful protesters in a march from a church in Selma that was forcibly intercepted by police on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, named after a Confederate general and Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. The coverage of Bloody Sunday, as the Selma violence became known, in print and on television, galvanized the nation, and it helped lead to the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. African Americans at the time made up more than half the population of Dallas County and Selma. Yet violently enforced voter suppression meant that only 2% of African Americans in that county managed to make it through the registration process to exercise their legal right. It meant, to put this in more human terms, John Lewis's great-great-grandfather registered to vote after emancipation in 1867, but due to the backlash of Jim Crow rule, no one else in John Lewis's family could do so for over 100 years. after the passage of that bill, Congressman John Lewis and his parents could vote in Alabama. Now, he had made this symbolic pilgrimage for many years, decades, but that event allowed him to do what he hadn't before, which was to speak about the power of narrative work in front of his congressional colleagues. And I felt in that conversation that he saw it as the unfinished work of the civil rights movement. When he passed, I wondered if there might be a comrade in the form of another lawyer who could help me take this work forward. And so it was truly a God dream when you answered the call to start this work together. One of the central questions that animated John Lewis's life is one that we're still trying to address now. When are we going to give up the lie? When are we going to give up the lie that there's any basis for this narrative of racial difference and supremacy that still divides us? We know we cannot do that without the work of narrative. The racial divide around the world, and especially in the United States, is built on a fiction of there being any basis for this idea of racial supremacy. And the only way to convince people that a fiction is fact is to transform the narrative that legitimates it. To combat the myth and the narrative that legitimated and justified the designation of African Americans as 3/5 human being in the Constitution under law would require the work of culture, narrative. And in the face of unjust law, we're seeing here in our convening and historically that culture has been critical. Propaganda, as I see it, replaces what appears to be a fact with a narrative. It's often only the work of art and culture that can reverse it. This is what John Lewis knew. He knew this from his time with Romare Bearden and Danny Lyons, sharing a room with Danny Lyons, in fact, tripping over darkroom chemicals in their bathroom. He understood the power of what those photographs would detonate for the nation. This is what Frederick Douglass understood as well. He knew that in the 1860s, one of the strongest forces to push back against propaganda had been born with the technology of the camera, and with it, new capacities to democratize representation in the United States. Few spoke about the potential of the image, of the arts, as a weapon in the political arena more than Douglass. And he developed an idea that he said during the Civil War might take 150 years for us to better understand. We'll open our convening today with a landmark artist who he anticipated would come and is truly at the headwaters of this idea in Ava DuVernay. Culture works as a precondition for justice, and this belated understanding really requires a fundamental reconsideration of how we animate the democratic imagination. It's why I know Sherrilyn and I are so thrilled to see in this audience so many who could be on this stage with us. We are creating new community through this event. I mentioned Douglass at the start. I mentioned Lewis at the start because so much of our understanding of the importance of culture for justice began during the Civil War and its legacy. The ratification of the 14th Amendment came to be a weapon to assert humanity, to contest injustice, and to make real the right to representation when it was denied in the Constitution. But the despair that's written into the 14th Amendment, all of the conditions, all the anticipation of how equal protection under the law would be fought against, indicated that another lever would be required in the work of culture. You heard me say yesterday, I believe that culture works for justice for 3 reasons. I think it's a route to advocacy when the judicial system offers no means for redress. It has been one of the earliest forms of contestation and critique, and it transforms observers into collective agents. It's important we address this topic today because we are now in this post-civil rights generation, one generation removed from this collective consciousness awakening, but we are still in the midst of this narrative war. And it's akin to a kind of collective trauma. what moves us out of trauma, what moves us out of the sense of everything looping, of things being unresolved, is the transformation of narrative, the transformation of the story of who it is that we are together. It takes more than rational argument to convince people to move past their blind spots. We saw this during the Civil War. We saw the impact of photographs in the contemporary age that transformed people's understanding of injustice in Flint, Michigan, which we'll hear more about from Dr. Hannah Mona, Chelsea Clinton, LaToya Ruby Frazier, and Dr. Uche Blackstock. We know the power of culture for justice as we think about artists like Keith Haring and Felix Gonzalez Torres and the collective grand fury that made visible the AIDS crisis in a time of government inaction. And finally, I would say, if you don't believe that culture works for justice, that it's a strong force against law that's unjust in this country, what do we say about work so seemingly incendiary that they are being censored, banned, removed from walls? We are living in an untold story about the power of culture for justice, one that Lewis understood, Douglas understood, Sherrilyn Ifill understands, and that I know the speaker we will be with next deeply feels and conveys to us all with her extraordinary work. We're living in generation time where we have to look to the past for levers to continue our work moving forward. And I'm so grateful to be able to do this with all of you and with my comrade who's going to come back onto the stage.